Dog saves a lost baby in the woods. What happened next left the family in tears. Here's the introduction to your story, written according to your instructions. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. The forest was unnervingly quiet that night. Not a single cricket chirped, not a single owl hooted. Instead, a low fog crept across the ground, weaving through the trees like a ghostly veil. Under the pale light of the moon, shadows stretched long and ominous, as if the woods themselves were alive, watching. It was the kind of silence that made even the bravest hesitate. Down a narrow dirt road on the edge of the forest, the Thompson family was sitting around the dinner table, the faint hum of a baby monitor cutting through their conversation. The monitor, resting innocently on the kitchen counter, crackled briefly, catching Sarah Thompson's attention. She glanced at it, her motherly instincts instantly on high alert. The soft sound of her baby, Lily, breathing was always a source of comfort. But tonight, the static seemed wrong. Sarah tilted her head. "Did you hear that?" she asked her husband Tom, who was busy cutting into his steak. "Hear what?" he replied, barely looking up. "I don't know. Something on the monitor. It sounded off." Tom set down his fork, his brow furrowing. "I'm sure it's nothing," he said. "Maybe interference or something." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She stood up, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and walked over to the baby monitor. She pressed her ear close, and that's when she heard it. A faint whimper. It wasn't Lily's. Her heart dropped. "Tom, I'm going upstairs to check on Lily," she said, her voice tight. "I'll come with you," he said quickly, sensing the unease in her tone. The couple rushed up the stairs, their feet barely making a sound on the carpet. When they reached Lily's room, Sarah pushed the door open, her eyes darting straight to the crib. It was empty. "Tom," Sarah's voice was a whisper, trembling with panic. Tom froze, his eyes scanning the room, in disbelief. The window was slightly ajar, the curtains billowing softly in the night breeze. His stomach churned. "She's not here," he said, his voice cracking. Suddenly, a bark echoed from outside, loud and sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was Max, their golden retriever. He barked again, more frantic this time, as if calling for them. Tom ran to the window, looking out into the backyard. There, in the moonlight, he saw Max standing at the edge of the forest, his body tense and his ears perked. He was looking into the woods, barking at something they couldn't see. "He's trying to tell us something," Sarah said, already heading for the door. "Wait! You're not thinking of going out there, are you?" Tom asked, grabbing her arm. "Tom, our baby is missing. What choice do we have?" She shot back, tears welling in her eyes. Tom didn't argue. He grabbed a flashlight from the hall closet and followed Sarah outside. Max was already pacing, his tail stiff, his nose pointed toward the forest. The moment he saw them, he took off into the woods. "Max, wait!" Tom called, but the dog didn't stop. Sarah's heart pounded as they followed Max into the darkness. The trees closed in around them, and the air grew colder. Every snap of a twig underfoot felt like a warning, but they pressed on, desperate to find their daughter. And then Max stopped. He stood still, staring ahead, his body low to the ground. A low growl rumbled from his throat. "What is it, boy?" Tom whispered, his flashlight trembling in his hands. Max barked once, sharp and loud, before darting forward. Tom and Sarah exchanged a nervous glance before following him deeper into the forest, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. Mini cliffhanger. What had Max found in the woods? And more importantly, was it too late to save? The darkness of the forest seemed to swallow them whole. Each step felt heavier than the last as Tom and Sarah followed Max deeper into the woods. The flashlight beam flickered, bouncing off twisted branches and casting eerie shadows on the ground. The air was thick and damp, and the faint rustle of leaves above only heightened their unease. Max moved with purpose, his nose low to the ground, sniffing frantically. He'd occasionally stop, let out a sharp bark, and then charge ahead, as if he knew exactly where he was going. "Do you think he really knows?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Tom admitted, trying to sound confident. "But we have to trust him." Suddenly, Max stopped at the base of a towering oak tree. He barked furiously, his paws digging at the earth as if he were trying to uncover something. "What is it, boy?" Tom asked, shining the flashlight on the spot where Max was digging. Sarah gasped. There, just beneath a layer of dirt and leaves, was a small pink blanket. Lily's blanket. "She was here," Sarah whispered, clutching the blanket to her chest. Her hands trembled and tears welled up in her eyes. Tom's jaw tightened. "We're close," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. Max barked again, snapping them out of their moment. He darted forward, leading them further into the woods. This time, his movements were more urgent, his barks sharper. As they followed, the forest seemed to grow denser. The trees loomed taller, their gnarled branches intertwining like a cage. The ground was uneven, littered with roots that threatened to trip them with every step. Sarah stumbled, nearly falling, but Tom caught her just in time. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, though her face was pale. "We have to keep going." They pushed forward, their breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like a warning, and then they heard it, a faint cry. Sarah froze, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Tom nodded, his grip on the flashlight tightening. The cry came again, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "It's her," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "It's Lily." Max let out a loud bark and took off running. This time Tom and Sarah didn't hesitate. They ran after him, their fear overshadowed by hope. The sound of Lily's cries grew louder as they approached a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, stood Max, his body tense and his tail wagging cautiously. And there, lying on a bed of moss, was Lily. Sarah let out a sob of relief and rushed forward, scooping Lily into her arms. The baby was crying, her tiny hands reaching for her mother. "Oh, thank God," Sarah whispered, holding Lily close. Tom knelt beside them, his hand on Lily's head. "She's okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But their relief was short-lived. A low growl rumbled through the air, sending chills down their spines. Max's ears perked up, and his body went rigid. He placed himself between the Thompsons and the edge of the clearing, his teeth bared and his growl growing louder. "What is it?" Sarah whispered, clutching Lily tightly. Tom shone the flashlight toward the trees, his heart pounding. The beam caught movement, something big, lurking just beyond the shadows. Then it stepped into the light, a wolf. Its eyes glowed yellow in the darkness, and its fur was matted and wild. It snarled, baring sharp teeth, and took a step closer. "Tom." Sarah's voice was barely audible, her fear palpable. Tom stood, placing himself between the wolf and his family. "Stay back," he said, his voice trembling. Max barked furiously, his body low to the ground, ready to attack. The wolf snarled in response, its gaze locked on the dog. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The tension in the air was suffocating. The only sounds, the low growls of Max and the wolf. Then the wolf lunged. Max sprang into action, meeting the wolf head-on. The two animals clashed, a flurry of teeth and fur. Max barked and snapped, his movements quick and calculated, while the wolf growled and lunged, its sheer size making it a formidable opponent. "Max!" Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. Tom grabbed a large branch from the ground and swung it at the wolf, trying to help Max. "Get away!" he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. The wolf turned its attention to Tom, snarling as it prepared to lunge again. But Max wasn't done. With a fierce bark, he leapt onto the wolf, sinking his teeth into its neck. The wolf yelped, and thrashed, trying to shake Max off. But Max held on, his determination unwavering. Finally, the wolf broke free and bolted back into the woods, its snarls fading into the distance. Max stood there, panting and covered in scratches, but victorious. "Good boy," Tom said, dropping to his knees and hugging Max. "You're a hero." Sarah joined them, still clutching Lily. "Thank you, Max," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Max wagged his tail weakly, his eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and pride. But then Sarah noticed something. "Tom, he's hurt," she said, pointing to a deep gash on Max's side. Tom's heart sank. "We need to get him home. Now." Sarah nodded, cradling Lily tightly as they made their way back through the forest. Max limped beside them, his strength waning, but his spirit unbroken. By the time they reached the house, dawn was breaking. The soft light of the rising sun bathed the world in a warm glow, a stark contrast to the terror of the night. Tom and Sarah quickly bandaged Max's wound and called the vet, who assured them that Max would recover with some rest. As they sat in the living room, with Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib and Max resting at their feet, Sarah looked at Tom, her eyes filled with gratitude. "He saved her," she said. "He saved all of us." Tom nodded, his hand resting on Max's head. "He's more than a dog. He's family. Mini cliffhanger." While Max had saved the day, the Thompsons couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the night's events. Why had Lily been taken into the woods in the first place? The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock and Max's soft breathing as he rested on the rug. Tom and Sarah sat close together, exhaustion etched into their faces. But unable to sleep, Lily was safe in her crib, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, but the events of the night still weighed heavily on their minds. "I don't understand," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "How did Lily end up out there? She couldn't have crawled all the way into the woods on her own." Tom rubbed his temples, his eyes narrowing in thought. "I've been asking myself the same thing. There's no way this was an accident." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She glanced toward the window, where the first rays of dawn were filtering through the curtains. The world outside looked serene, but she couldn't shake the sense that something was amiss. Max stirred, letting out a soft whine. His ears perked up and he lifted his head, his eyes alert. "What is it, boy?" Tom asked, kneeling beside him. Max's gaze was fixed on the door, his body tense. A sudden knock shattered the fragile silence of the room. Tom and Sarah exchanged a startled glance. It was barely morning. Who could it be at this hour? Tom rose cautiously, motioning for Sarah to stay back. He opened the door slowly, his heart pounding. Standing on the porch was their neighbor, Mr. Grayson. He was an elderly man with a stooped posture and piercing gray eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He held his wide-brimmed hat in his hands, turning it nervously. "Mr. Grayson," Tom said, confused. "Sorry to bother you so early," Mr. Grayson said, his voice low and gravelly. "But I saw the lights on and thought I should come by. There's something you need to know." Sarah stepped closer, clutching the blanket Lily had been found with. "What is it?" she asked, her voice wary. Mr. Grayson hesitated, his eyes flicking to Max, who was now standing, his tail stiff and his body alert. "It's about the woods," he said finally. "And the stories." Tom frowned. "What stories?" Mr. Grayson sighed, stepping inside as Tom gestured for him to enter. He sat down heavily in a chair, his hands gripping his hat tightly. "I've lived in this town my whole life," he began, "and there are things about those woods that people don't talk about. Things that have happened over the years, disappearances, strange sightings." Sarah paled. "Disappearances?" Mr. Grayson nodded. "Not just people, animals too. Folks around here call it the Wailing Woods. They say it's cursed. And there's one story that always comes up, a legend about a shadowy figure. that takes what's most precious to you. Tom's jaw tightened. That's ridiculous. You're saying some supernatural force took our daughter. I know how it sounds, Mr. Grayson said, his voice firm, but you can't ignore the pattern. My own brother vanished in those woods when I was a boy. We never found him. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. Why would something like that take Lily? She's just a baby. That's the thing, Mr. Grayson said. It doesn't just take randomly. It's drawn to pain, to fear. If you've been going through something difficult, it might have been enough to draw it out. Tom and Sarah exchanged a look. The past few months had been hard on them. Financial struggles, sleepless nights, the stress of raising a baby. They'd argued more than they cared to admit, the weight of their worries pressing down on them. But why her? Sarah whispered. Mr. Grayson's gaze softened. Because she's your light. It takes what you hold dearest, what would break you to lose. A heavy silence fell over the room. Tom clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. So, what, we're just supposed to accept this, that something tried to take our daughter? No, Mr. Grayson said, his eyes hardening. There's a way to stop it, but it's risky. Tom leaned forward. Tell me. Mr. Grayson hesitated. It's said that the shadow can't stand light, true light, the kind that comes from courage and love. If you confront it, face it without fear, it'll leave you alone. But if you falter... He trailed off, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Sarah clutched Tom's arm. You're not seriously considering this? What choice do we have? Tom said, his voice steady. We can't live in fear, wondering if it'll come back. Max let out a low growl, drawing their attention. He was staring at the window, his body tense. Tom's blood ran cold. The shadows outside the window seemed to ripple, shifting unnaturally. It's here, Mr. Grayson said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom stood, his jaw set. Stay with Lily, he said to Sarah. I'm going to end this. Tom, no, Sarah cried, grabbing his arm. He turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. We can't let it control us. We have to fight. Max barked, his tail wagging furiously as he moved to Tom's side. Tom stepped outside, the flashlight in one hand and the branch he'd used earlier in the other. The air was thick and heavy, and the forest seemed to close in around him. Max walked beside him, his growl low and steady. The shadows moved, coalescing into a dark, towering figure with glowing yellow eyes. Tom's grip on the flashlight tightened. You can't have her, he said, his voice strong. The figure let out a low, menacing growl, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. Max barked, lunging at the figure, but it swatted him away with a shadowy tendril. Max yelped, but quickly got back on his feet, standing protectively in front of Tom. Tom took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He shone the flashlight directly at the figure, the beam cutting through the darkness. The figure recoiled, letting out an unearthly screech. Tom stepped forward, his voice steady. You won't take her. You won't take anything from us. The light grew brighter as if responding to his resolve. The shadows began to dissolve, the figure's form unraveling like smoke in the wind. With one final, ear-splitting screech, the figure disappeared, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Tom collapsed to his knees, the flashlight falling from his hands. Max nudged him gently, his tail wagging. It's over, Tom whispered, tears streaming down his face. When Tom returned to the house, Sarah was waiting for him, Lily in her arms. She ran to him, hugging him tightly. It's gone, he said, his voice trembling. It's gone. Max barked softly, wagging his tail. They knew the shadow might never return, but the night had changed them. It had reminded them of what truly mattered, each other. And they would never take that for granted again. The dim glow of the lantern flickered as Tom stood on the threshold, his hand trembling against the doorframe. The cool night air pressed in, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the eerie silence of the woods. Behind him, Sarah sat clutching Lily, her face pale with fear. Max stood at Tom's side, his ears perked and his low growl rumbling like distant thunder. "What are you doing?" Sarah's voice wavered as she saw Tom grabbing his flashlight. Tom turned to her, his jaw set in grim determination. "I'm ending this, Sarah. Whatever's out there isn't going to leave us alone. I need to face it. You can't just—" Sarah began, but the look in his eyes stopped her. "Please, Tom, don't go alone." Max barked softly, as if agreeing with her. "I'm not alone," Tom replied, glancing down at Max, who was already pacing toward the door. "And I won't let it take her again." The moment Tom stepped outside, the world felt different. The woods were no longer the familiar place he had known all his life. They seemed alive, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy that tugged at the edges of his sanity. He could feel it watching him. The flashlight beam swept across the ground, catching the gnarled roots of trees and the occasional glint of dew. Max moved ahead, his nose to the ground, leading the way toward the clearing where they had found Lily. Tom's breath came in shallow bursts as he approached the spot. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the unseen pressing down on him. He stopped abruptly when Max froze, his hackles rising. The dog let out a guttural growl, his gaze fixed on the shadows ahead. Then it appeared, a figure, impossibly tall and shrouded in darkness, seemed to materialize from the air itself. Its form was not solid, but an ever-shifting mass of shadow, its edges curling and dissipating like smoke. Two piercing yellow eyes glowed from the center, staring directly at Tom. Tom felt his knees weaken, but he held his ground. He shone the flashlight at the figure, but the light seemed to dim in its presence, swallowed by the darkness. "You won't take her," Tom said, his voice shaking but resolute. "You hear me? You can't have her." The figure tilted its head almost as if it were amused. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a sound that resonated deep in Tom's chest, a low, guttural noise that conveyed menace and intent. The air grew colder, and the flashlight flickered. Max barked ferociously, lunging at the figure, but a tendril of shadow lashed out, striking the dog and sending him sprawling to the ground. "Max!" Tom cried, his heart sinking. The dog staggered back to his feet, growling despite the blow. The figure advanced, its shadowy form spreading across the ground like a living thing. Tom's grip on the flashlight tightened. He took a step back, his mind racing. He couldn't fight this thing, not with his hands, not with a beam of light. But then he remembered Mr. Grayson's words. "It's drawn to pain, to fear. But it cannot stand true light, the kind that comes from courage and love." Tom clenched his fists, his thoughts racing. He thought of Lily, of her laughter, her tiny hands gripping his fingers. He thought of Sarah, her unwavering support despite the struggles they had faced. They were his light, his reason for fighting. The figure loomed closer, its tendrils reaching out, but Tom stood his ground. He dropped the flashlight, letting it clatter to the ground. "You can't have her," he said again, his voice stronger this time. "You can't take what doesn't belong to you." The figure paused, as if considering his words. Its glowing eyes narrowed, and the shadows around it seemed to writhe in agitation. Tom took a step forward. "You thrive on fear, don't you? On pain, but I'm not afraid of you, not anymore." The figure let out an ear-splitting screech, its form twisting and contorting. The shadows lashed out, but they stopped inches from Tom, as if repelled by an invisible force. Max barked again, standing by Tom's side, his tail wagging defiantly. Tom's voice rose, filled with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. "You have no power here, not over me, not over my family. Now leave." The light from the flashlight, still lying on the ground, began to grow brighter. It wasn't the harsh, artificial glow of the bulb, but something warmer, purer. It spread outward, washing over the clearing and illuminating the trees in golden light. The figure let out another screech, its form dissolving into the air like smoke in the wind. The shadows receded, retreating into the depths of the forest until nothing remained but silence. Tom collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving. Max licked his face, whining softly. "It's over," Tom whispered, tears streaming down his face. "It's finally over." Back at the house, Sarah rushed to the door as Tom and Max returned. She threw her arms around him, sobbing into his chest. "Is it gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tom nodded, his arms tightening around her. "It's gone. It won't bother us again." Lily cooed softly in Sarah's arms, her tiny fingers reaching out to grasp Tom's shirt. Tom smiled through his tears, kissing her forehead. Max barked, wagging his tail as if to confirm the victory. They knew the shadow might never truly disappear from the world, but in their hearts, they had defeated it. It was their love, their courage, that had banished it, and that would protect them in the days to come. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the family huddled together, their bond stronger than ever. And in the woods, the shadows watched from afar, waiting for the day when fear might once again open the door.